The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1879, carried by a rider who had worn 2 horses lame getting it to Helena, and before Lewis Keene had broken the wax seal, he already knew that whatever waited inside it would cost him everything he owned. He stood on the porch of his ranch house, the Bar K, with the Montana wind cutting down off the mountains and turning the aspens gold and shivering, and he read the words twice because the first time his eyes would not believe them. Your brother Daniel is dying. The fever took hold 3 weeks past, and the doctor says his lungs are failing him. He asks for you every night, though he has not spoken your name in 11 years without cursing it. Come if you are still the kind of man who can. There is not much time left. Emily Keene, 11 years. Lewis had not seen his brother's face in 11 years, not since the night he had stood in a Texas courthouse and let the sheriff believe that Daniel had forged their father's will, when it had been Lewis's own hand that had done the forging, Lewis's own greed that had wanted the whole of the rocking K spread instead of half. He had watched Daniel dragged out of that county in disgrace, penniless, branded a thief in a land where a man's word was the only currency that mattered more than gold, and he had said nothing. He had kept the ranch. He had kept the cattle. He had kept everything except the one thing that had ever truly belonged to him, which was his brother's trust, and in the years since he had built that stolen inheritance into something far larger, a cattle empire that stretched across 2 territories, mining shares in Butte, a half-interest in the northern Pacific spur line that fed cattle cars east. He was a rich man. He was, by any measure the frontier respected, a success. He had also not slept a full night in 11 years without seeing Daniel's face as they dragged him away, calling out one last time, not for mercy, but for an explanation Lewis never gave. Now there was a chance, one last one, to give it. He folded the letter with hands that would not stop trembling and walked back inside to where his foreman, a weathered man named Turner, was totaling the fall tally of cattle sold. "Turner," he said, "I need to reach Larkspur in the Wyoming Territory inside of 2 weeks. Tell me it's possible." Turner looked up, frowning at the map tacked to the wall behind his desk. "That's near 400 miles, boss, and the rail only takes you as far as Rock Springs this time of year if it's running at all. After that it's stage and horse, and there's already snow talk coming down from the Wind River country. 2 weeks is tight, might not be possible at all if the passes close early." "Make it possible," Lewis said, "whatever it costs." And that was the thing about a man who had built an empire on the bones of a lie. When the moment came that mattered more than the empire, he found he did not hesitate to burn it to the ground to buy back a little time. He sold the Bar K within 4 days, 12,000 head of cattle and 18,000 acres of grazing land, to Silas Grant, a rival rancher from the Gallatin Valley who had coveted the Bar K's water rights for years and had never once liked Lewis Keene, though he had always respected the size of his purse. Grant offered him 60 cents on the dollar, knowing Lewis had no time to haggle, and Lewis took it without argument, which told Grant more than any contract could that something had gone wrong in the world of a man who never before had let a nickel slip through his fingers without a fight. "You're a strange sort of fool, Keene," Grant said, as they shook hands over the deed in the front room of the Bar K, the fire popping behind them, Lewis's whole life reduced to a stack of paper on a walnut desk. "A man works 30 years to build a thing like this, and then he gives it away for a train ticket and a prayer." "It isn't a prayer," Lewis said quietly. "It's an apology, 11 years overdue." Grant studied him a long moment, something almost like respect flickering behind his flat gray eyes. "Well, I hope whoever's waiting on the other end of that apology is worth what you're paying for it." "He's my brother," Lewis said, and did not explain further, because some debts were not meant to be discussed with the men who bought the roof over your head. He kept back only enough gold to pay his passage, hire a guide through the high country if the trains failed him, and leave a small sum in a bank draft for Turner and the hands who had served him faithfully, and now found themselves out of work through no fault of their own. Everything else, the mining shares, the rail interest, the fine leather-bound library he had collected in his rise from a Texas cattleman's disgraced older brother into a Montana baron, he liquidated inside a week, at whatever price the market would bear, because there was no arithmetic in the world that could tell him how much an hour was worth when his brother was dying 400 miles away with a curse still sitting on his lips. The train from Helena carried him as far south as it could before the rails gave out into unfinished grade, and from there he rode a rattling stagecoach through country turning the color of dried blood with autumn, mountains rising up blue and hard-edged in the distance, until on the 9th day, somewhere in the high sage country of the Wyoming Territory, the axle of the coach snapped clean in two on a rutted stretch of road, and Lewis Keene found himself standing in the cold with his one remaining trunk of belongings. 40 miles from the nearest town, and no way forward. The driver, a grizzled man named Prout, spat a stream of tobacco into the dust and shook his head at the ruined axle like it was a personal betrayal. Nearest place with a blacksmith and fresh horses is the Hurst relay station, about 6 miles on. We'll have to walk it, or you can wait here while I go fetch help. How long will that take? Better part of a day there and back. Lewis felt the 2 weeks Turner had warned him about shrinking down to something closer to 10 days, then 8, and something in his chest went tight and cold. "I'll walk," he said. The Hurst relay station sat at the mouth of a shallow canyon where a creek ran fast and clear over red stone, a low log building with a corral and a barn and smoke curling from a stone chimney. And it was there, walking up the frozen wagon track in the last gray light of an October afternoon, that Lewis Keene first laid eyes on Anna Hurst, and did not yet know that she would become the second great turning point of his life, arriving close on the heels of the first. She was standing in the corral gentling a horse that had thrown a shoe and did not want to be caught, moving with a quiet, unhurried patience that told him more about her character in 30 seconds than most men's resumes told him in an hour. She wore a man's canvas coat over a wool dress, her dark hair pulled back beneath a battered felt hat, and when she finally noticed him standing at the fence rail, she did not startle, only finished looping the lead rope before she turned to face him with clear, appraising eyes the color of creek water in shadow. "You're either lost, or that coach from Rock Springs finally gave up on the road like I told the company it would," she said. "The axle broke," Lewis said. "About 6 miles back, driver's gone for help." Prout's coach figured as much. That axle's been complaining since August. She looked him over once, taking in the fine cut of his coat, gone dusty from the road, the trunk he had somehow carried the whole 6 miles despite its weight, the exhaustion carved into his face that had nothing to do with a broken axle. "You look like a man running from something or toward it." "Toward it," Lewis said. "My brother is dying in Larkspur. I need to reach him before the pass is close." Something shifted in her expression then, some private grief crossing behind her eyes before she covered it. "Larkspur's another 110 miles past the Wind River crossing, and the first snow's already down on Union Pass. You won't make it in a stagecoach, not this time of year, and not with the roads the way they are." "Then how?" "Horse, and a guide who knows the game trails instead of the wagon roads, and even then you're gambling with the weather." She studied him another moment. "Come inside. It's near dark and you look like you haven't eaten since Rock Springs." The inside of the relay station was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the good plain smell of stew simmering on the stove. And it was there, over a meal she did not have to offer a stranger but did anyway, that Lewis Keene learned Anna Hurst's story, offered in the plain, unadorned way of a woman who had long since stopped expecting sympathy and had learned to live without needing it. She had come west from Ohio with her husband, Thomas Hurst, 6 years before, to build this very station on a contract with the stage line. And 2 winters ago Thomas had ridden out into a blizzard to bring in a stranded traveler and had not come back. Found 3 days later frozen against a boulder half a mile from a shelter, he had not been able to see through the white. She had kept the station running alone since, because it was the only thing left of the life they had planned together, and because the stage line needed the relay and she needed the money, and because, she said without any particular self-pity, a woman on the frontier who stopped moving forward generally did not survive the stopping. "I'm sorry," Lewis said, meaning it more than the words could carry. "Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change the math of it." She refilled his coffee without being asked. "Now, tell me about this brother of yours, and why you're carrying a trunk full of gold-plated shirt studs into weather that's going to kill you if you're not careful." So he told her. Not all of it, not that first night, but enough. That his name was Daniel, that they had once run cattle together in Texas as boys who thought the whole world was going to be theirs, that there had been trouble over their father's will, that Daniel had left in disgrace and Lewis had stayed and prospered, and that a letter had come from Daniel's wife saying the fever had settled in his lungs and there was little time. He did not tell her that first night that the disgrace had been his own doing, dressed up in his brother's name. That confession would come later, on a colder night in a smaller space, when the truth had nowhere left to hide. Anna listened without interrupting, and when he finished she sat back and regarded him with an expression he could not quite read, somewhere between suspicion and reluctant sympathy. "There's a man in the valley, name of Cole Bridger, does guiding for the stage company when the regular roads wash out. Knows every game trail between here and the Wind River Basin. I could send word for him in the morning." "How long would that take?" 2 days there, 2 back if the weather holds." Lewis closed his eyes briefly. 4 days he did not have. "Is there no faster way?" Anna was quiet a long moment, turning her cup slowly in her hands, and when she spoke again her voice had gone low and considering. "I know the trails as well as Cole does. Better some of them since I've ridden this basin longer than he's lived here. If the station can spare me for 2 weeks and I trust my hired man Silas Ford to hold it while I'm gone, I could guide you myself. Faster than sending for Cole and waiting on him to arrive." "You do that? For a stranger?" Something flickered across her face, quick and complicated. "I lost my husband to a mountain that didn't care whether he lived or died. I've got no patience left for watching another man throw his life away on that same mountain out of pride, thinking he can beat whether he doesn't understand. If you're going over Union past this time of year, you're going with someone who knows it, or you're not going at all. I'd rather it be me than watch you become a story somebody tells next spring about a fool who froze 6 miles short of Larkspur." Lewis looked at her across the rough plank table, at the firelight catching the strong, clean lines of her face, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a name for yet, something that had nothing to do with the 11 years of guilt he carried, and everything to do with the plain fact that he had not, in a very long time, met anyone who told him the truth without first calculating what it would cost her to do so. "Then I accept," he said. "And I'm grateful, Mrs. Hurst, more than I know how to say." "Don't thank me yet," Anna said, standing to clear the plates. "Thank me in Larkspur if we get there at all." They left 2 mornings later, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridges, riding 2 sturdy mountain horses Anna had bred and trained herself, with a pack mule carrying provisions, bedrolls, and enough grain to see the horses through the high country where grazing would be thin. Lewis had left the trunk of fine clothes behind at the station, keeping only what he could carry in a single saddlebag, and something about shedding that weight, that last visible remnant of the fortune he had spent to get this far, felt like the first honest thing he had done in 11 years. The trail climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine going bare and gold with autumn, following a route that Anna navigated with an ease that spoke of long familiarity, pointing out landmarks Lewis would never have noticed on his own. A split boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, a spring that ran even in the driest months, a ridge line that offered shelter from the worst of the wind. She rode with an economy of motion that made the miles seem shorter than they were, and in the long silences between conversation, Lewis found himself studying her, the way she read the sky before she read the trail, the quiet competence in everything she did, and thinking that he had spent 11 years building an empire of cattle and rail shares, and had somehow never once, in all that time, encountered a person who seemed so entirely, uncomplicatedly at peace with who she was. On the third day, the weather that had been threatening since Helena finally arrived. They were crossing a high meadow below the shoulder of a mountain Anna called Split Tooth when the sky, which had been merely gray and low, turned suddenly the color of a bruise, and the wind came down off the peaks with a voice like something alive. "Storm's coming faster than I read it," Anna shouted over the rising wind. "There's a line shack half a mile east, used by sheepherders in summer. We need to reach it before this breaks or we'll be caught out in the open." They rode hard, the horses laboring against wind that seemed determined to push them back down the mountain, and reached the small log shack just as the first hard pellets of snow began to drive sideways across the meadow. Inside, they got a fire going in the rough stone hearth, and hobbled the horses and the mule in the lean-to attached to the shack's north side, and by the time full dark came down, the wind outside had risen to a scream, and the little shack shuddered with each gust like something trying to shake itself apart. "We're not moving until this breaks," Anna said, feeding another piece of split wood into the fire. "Could be a few hours, could be 2 days. High country storms don't keep a schedule." Lewis sat across the small fire from her, watching the flames throw shifting light across her face, and felt the 2 weeks he had bought with his fortune narrowing down to something that made his stomach clench with dread. Daniel doesn't have 2 days to spare, if the letter was even close to accurate about how far the fever's gone. "I know," Anna said, not unkindly. "But dead men in a snowbank don't save anybody either. We wait it out, and we ride hard the moment it breaks. That's the only choice the mountain's giving us." They sat in silence a while, listening to the storm worry at the shack's timbers, and it was there, in that small fire-lit space with nowhere left to look but at each other, that Anna finally asked the question that had been sitting behind her eyes since the first night at the station. "You never told me the whole truth about your brother," she said. "You've got a way of talking around the edge of it, like a man circling a hole in the ice, careful not to look straight down into it. What happened between you two, really?" Lewis stared into the fire for a long moment. Outside, the wind howled like something grieving, and inside his chest, 11 years of silence pressed up against his ribs, demanding to finally be let out into the world where someone besides himself and God might judge it. "I ruined him," he said finally. "That's the truth of it, plain as I know how to say it. Our father died and left the rocking K to be split between us, half and half, same as he'd always promised. I wanted the whole of it. I forged a codicil to the will, made it look like Daniel's hand, made it look like he'd tried to cheat me and our father both out of what was rightfully mine, and when the lawyer and the sheriff came around asking questions, I let every one of them believe Daniel was the liar and I was the wronged brother. He was run out of the county inside a month, called a thief in every saloon and church social from there to the Brazos. I kept the ranch. I kept every acre of it, and I built it into something bigger than our father ever dreamed. And I told myself for years that Daniel would land on his feet somewhere, that he was tougher than people gave him credit for. And I let that story comfort me every single night I didn't sleep because of what I'd done." Anna said nothing for a long moment, her face unreadable in the firelight, and Lewis found he could not read whether her silence was disgust or simple shock, and some old cowardly part of him wanted badly to fill that silence with excuses, but he made himself sit in it instead, because he had promised himself somewhere on the trail up from the relay station that whatever else happened, he would not lie to this woman the way he had lied to everyone else in his life. "That's an ugly thing to carry 11 years, Anna said finally. "I know it. And now he's dying, and you sold everything you built on the back of that lie, just to have the chance to stand in front of him and say you're sorry." She looked at him then, straight on, in a way that made him feel entirely seen, stripped of the fine coat and the reputation and every other thing he had used for 11 years to convince himself he was still a good man underneath the theft. Why now? Why not 5 years ago or 10, when maybe there was still time to fix something more than just your conscience? Because I was a coward, Lewis said, and the words came out rough, scraped raw. Because as long as I didn't have to look him in the eye, I could keep telling myself it wasn't as bad as I knew it was. It took his wife's letter, took the word dying sitting right there on the page, to finally make me understand that I'd rather lose every cent I own than lose the chance to say I was wrong, before there's no brother left to say it to. He looked at her, and something in his chest cracked open further than he had intended to let it. I'm not asking you to think well of me, Anna. I know what I did. I've known it every day for 11 years. I'm only telling you the truth because you asked for it, and because you've done nothing but decent by me since I stumbled up your road with a trunk full of things that turned out not to matter at all. Anna was quiet a long while, and outside the storm had begun, almost imperceptibly, to ease, the wind screamed softening to something more like a low moan. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its edge of judgment and settled into something gentler, something that sounded almost like understanding earned the hard way. My husband used to say that the frontier doesn't care what a man was back east or what he did before he came out here. Only cares what he does next out here with the life he's got left. She poked at the fire, sending up a small shower of sparks. You did an ugly thing, Lewis Keene. I won't pretend otherwise, and I won't pretend it doesn't change how I look at you some. But you're also the first man I've met in a long while willing to burn down everything he built rather than die with that ugly thing still sitting unspoken between him and the person he wronged. That counts for something. Maybe not everything, but something. Thank you, Lewis said quietly, for not simply hating me for it. Ask me again in Larkspur, Anna said, with the faintest ghost of a smile. See if your brother feels the same generosity I'm feeling tonight, with a storm outside and nowhere else for either of us to be. They sat together as the fire burned low, and though neither of them said anything more about it that night, something had shifted in the small space between them, some door that had been closed now standing faintly, cautiously ajar. The storm broke by dawn, leaving the high meadow blanketed in nearly a foot of fresh snow that turned the whole world into something blinding and silent. And they pushed on before the sun had fully cleared the ridgeline, the horses laboring through drifts in places, Anna choosing a route along wind-scoured ground where the snow lay thinner. The delay had cost them the better part of 2 days, and Lewis felt every hour of it pressing against his ribs like a physical weight, though Anna kept a pace that was fast without being reckless, reading the terrain and the horse's strength with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. On the 5th day out from the relay station, descending through a narrow defile that Anna called Coyote Gap, they came upon 3 riders blocking the trail ahead, men with the hard, hungry look of drifters who had run out of honest options a long time before, and the lead rider, a lean man with a scarred jaw and a rifle held loose but ready across his saddle, called out for them to stop. That's a fine-looking mule you've got there, the scarred man said, and I'd wager that saddlebag's carrying something worth more than the horse it's strapped to. Climb down, both of you, nice and slow, and nobody needs to get hurt out here where it'd take a week for anybody to find the bodies. Lewis felt his pulse hammering, aware suddenly of how far they were from any law, any help, any witness beyond the mountains themselves, and he was reaching slowly for the pistol he carried in his coat when Anna's voice, calm and clear and utterly without fear, cut across the tension. That mule's carrying grain and bedrolls, and this man's saddlebag has exactly $40 and a letter about a dying brother in it, which I'd wager isn't worth the trouble of 3 men freezing out here waiting on a posse from Rock Springs that's already been alerted to riders matching your description working this pass. It was a bluff, Lewis realized, spoken with such flat confidence that even he almost believed it. You're welcome to the $40. You're not welcome to slow us down any further than you already have. Because if this man's brother dies while you're standing in our road admiring a pack mule, I promise you every lawman in 3 territories is going to hear exactly which pass you were working when it happened, and exactly what you look like. The scarred man studied her for a long moment, clearly unused to being addressed with such flat, fearless authority by anyone, let alone a woman on a mountain trail, and something in his hard face shifted, weighing the trouble against the reward. $40, he said finally. $40, Anna agreed, and you let us pass without further conversation. Lewis dug the coins from his saddlebag with hands that had gone unsteady with adrenaline, and tossed the small pouch to the scarred man, who caught it, counted it with a quick practiced motion, and then, with a gesture, moved his horse aside to clear the trail. "Pleasure doing business," he said, with a thin, humorless smile, and the three riders moved off north along a side trail, leaving Lewis and Anna to continue on, hearts pounding, into the widening light of the gap. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever watched anyone do," Lewis said, once the riders were well out of sight and hearing. "Little of both, probably," Anna said, though he could see her hands were trembling slightly on the reins now that the danger had passed. "Thomas used to say that most men looking to rob you are looking for an easy mark, not a fight. Show them you're not afraid, and half the time they decide the trouble isn't worth it." She glanced at him sideways. "The other half of the time it goes considerably worse. We were lucky today. You saved both our lives back there." "We saved each other's," Anna said. "You had that pistol half drawn. I saw it. If talking hadn't worked, you'd have given me the half-second I needed." She held his gaze a moment longer than strictly necessary before turning back to the trail ahead. "We make a fair team, Lewis Keene, for two people who met each other 6 days ago over a broken axle." Something warm bloomed in Lewis's chest at that, something that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air or the danger they had just walked through, and he found himself smiling for what felt like the first time in longer than he could remember. They rode on through the afternoon in a silence that had turned companionable rather than merely watchful, and that night, camped in a sheltered hollow with a small fire built low and careful against the wind, Anna spoke again about her husband, unprompted this time, as though the day's danger had loosened something in her the way Lewis's confession had loosened something in him 2 nights before. "Thomas wasn't a careful man," she said, staring into the fire. "That's the thing people don't understand when I tell them how he died. They think it must have been bad luck, some freak turn of weather nobody could have predicted. But the truth is he went out into a storm everybody at the station told him not to ride into, because there was a stranger stranded on the road and Thomas couldn't stand the thought of a man freezing to death within reach of help he could have given. He was the best man I ever knew, and he died because he couldn't stop himself from being exactly that good, even when it cost him everything." She looked up at Lewis across the fire. "I loved him for it. I still love him for it. But I spent 2 years afterward being angry at him too, for leaving me alone in that station with a contract to keep and no one to keep it with." "I'm sorry," Lewis said again, and this time Anna did not deflect it. "I know you are," she said. "I think you understand something about loss that most men don't, Lewis, even though yours has been 11 years of a different kind of grieving. The kind where the person you lost is still alive, just lost to you all the same." She was quiet a moment. "I hope you get there in time. I hope, whatever he says to you, whatever anger he's still carrying, that you get the chance to hear it to his face. Because I've learned the hard way that the things left unsaid are the heaviest weight a person can carry, heavier even than the things that go wrong between us." "Anna," Lewis said, and found he did not quite know what he meant to say next, only that something in him wanted to reach across the small fire and take her hand, wanted to tell her that in 6 days she had become the truest friend he had, that whatever waited for him in Larkspur, he was grateful beyond words that she was the one riding beside him toward it. "Get some sleep," Anna said gently, before he could find the words, though something in her eyes suggested she had heard the shape of what he had not said. "We've still got 60 hard miles ahead of us, and your brother's waiting." They crossed the Wind River 2 days later at a shallow ford Anna knew from years of running the relay station's supply trips, the water running icy and fast with autumn runoff. and beyond it the land began to drop toward the broad basin where Larkspur sat, a mining and cattle town of perhaps 800 souls strung along a single main street with a church at one end and a stamp mill at the other, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into a sky gone hard and blue with the first true cold of the season. They rode into town on the 11th day since Lewis had left Helena, exhausted, saddle-sore, the horses blowing hard from the final push down out of the foothills, and Lewis felt his heart hammering with a fear more consuming than anything the mountain storm or the drifters on the trail had managed to raise in him. What if they were too late? What if the letter, already weeks old by the time it reached him, had been written about a man already in his grave? They found the house on the north edge of town, a modest frame building with a garden gone brown with frost and a woman standing in the doorway who looked up at the sound of hooves with an expression that shifted, in the space of a heartbeat, from wariness to something between hope and disbelief. "You're Lewis," she said before he had even dismounted. "You have his eyes. God help me, you have exactly his eyes." "Emily," Lewis said, his voice unsteady. Is there still time?" Emily Keene, a slight woman with tired lines around her eyes and gray threading early through hair that had likely been dark a decade before, nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron in a gesture that seemed more nervous habit than practical need. "He's weaker every day. The doctor doesn't hold out much hope, truth told, but he's alive, and he's been asking for you since before I even sent that letter, though he'd never have admitted it if I'd told him I was writing to you." She looked past Lewis to Anna, taking in the trail dust and the weary competence of her, and something like gratitude crossed her face. "You brought him. Through that weather, you actually brought him." "Anna Hurst," Anna said, dismounting and extending a hand. "I run a relay station up past the Wind River crossing. Your husband's brother needed a guide through the high country, and I know those trails." "Thank you," Emily said, gripping Anna's hand with both of hers. "Thank you more than I have words for." She turned back to Lewis and her expression sobered. "He doesn't know I sent for you. I need you to understand that before you go in there. He may not want to see you at all. 11 years is a long time to carry a grudge, and Daniel has carried this one harder than most men carry anything." "I understand," Lewis said, though his heart was pounding with a dread that made the words feel thin. "I'd rather he refused to see me than never have the chance to try." Emily led him through the small house to a back bedroom where the curtains were drawn against the afternoon light, and the air held the particular heaviness of a sick room, medicine and wood smoke, and the shallow, labored sound of breathing that came from the bed against the far wall. Lewis stopped in the doorway, and for a long moment could not make his legs carry him further, because the man lying there, gaunt and gray and so much older than his memory of him, was and was not his brother both at once, 11 years compressed into every line of that ravaged face. "Daniel," he said, and his voice broke on the single syllable. The man in the bed turned his head slowly, and for a long moment his eyes, sunk deep with illness but still sharp, still unmistakably the eyes of the boy Lewis had grown up beside on the rocking quay, studied him with an expression that gave away nothing at all. "Well," Daniel said finally, his voice a thin rasp of what it must once have been. 11 years, and you finally found the road to Larkspur. I'd about given up believing you knew how to read a map." "Daniel, I don't," Daniel said, raising one thin hand from the blanket, and the effort of it seemed to cost him. "Don't come in here after 11 years of silence and start with excuses, Lewis. I've had a long time lying in this bed to think about what I'd say to you if this day ever came, and none of it starts with letting you talk first." Lewis stood frozen in the doorway, every carefully rehearsed apology he had composed across 400 miles of travel suddenly worthless in his throat, and behind him he felt Anna's presence in the hallway, steady and quiet, though she did not follow him into the room. "Say what you need to say," Lewis managed finally. "I came 400 miles to hear it, whatever it is." Daniel's laugh was a dry, painful sound with no real humor in it. 400 miles. "How generous of you, brother, to spare 400 miles for the man you let hang for your own crime." He struggled up slightly against his pillows, color coming into his gray face with the effort of his anger. Do you have any idea what those years were like, Lewis? Running from a name that meant thief in every town I passed through, because the story followed me on the telegraph faster than I could ride ahead of it. I couldn't get honest work for 2 years. I dug ditches and mucked stables under a false name because Daniel Keene meant liar and cheat clean across 3 territories. And the whole time, the whole entire time, you were sitting on our father's ranch getting richer off the lie that ruined me. I know, Lewis said, and the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, but he made himself keep going because Anna's voice was in his memory now, telling him that the things left unsaid were the heaviest weight a person could carry. I know exactly what I did, Daniel. I forged that codicil. I let the sheriff and the lawyer and the whole county believe it was your hand instead of mine, because I wanted the whole of the rocking K, and I told myself some lie about deserving it more than you did, working harder than you did, though God knows that was never true. I have known every single day for 11 years exactly what I stole from you, and exactly what it cost you, and I have hated myself for it every one of those days, and none of that hatred ever once helped you, because I was too much of a coward to come find you and say so. Daniel stared at him, breathing hard from the exertion of his anger, and something in his ravaged face seemed to be searching Lewis's for the first time, not for excuses, but for the shape of the truth. You're admitting it. After 11 years of letting me be the liar in every story ever told about the Keene brothers, you're finally standing here admitting it was you. It was me, Lewis said. It was always me. And I sold everything I built off that theft, every acre, every head of cattle, every mining share, to have the chance to stand here and tell you so before it was too late. I don't expect it to fix 11 years, Daniel. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only needed you to know the truth, finally, from my own mouth, because you deserved that a decade ago and I was too weak to give it to you. The room was silent except for the labored rhythm of Daniel's breathing, and Emily, standing near the foot of the bed with her hand pressed to her mouth, watched her husband's face with an expression caught between hope and old, exhausted grief. You sold the Bar K, Daniel said finally, wonderingly, as though the fact of it were only now settling into him. The whole empire you built, for this. For the chance to say I was wrong, Lewis said, and that I'm sorry, truly, completely sorry in a way I never had the courage to be before now. Daniel closed his eyes, and for a long moment Lewis feared he had exhausted whatever strength the sick man had left. But then Daniel spoke again, quieter now. The anger burned down to something more like grief. I used to lie awake some nights, back when I was still angry enough to hate you properly, and imagine all the things I'd say to you if I ever got the chance. Cruel things, Lewis. Things I'm not proud of wanting to say. But somewhere along the way, I got too tired to keep that fire burning, and what was left underneath it wasn't hate anymore. It was just this ache, this wondering whether my own brother even remembered what we used to be to each other before all of it. He opened his eyes again, and they were wet now, and so was his voice when he spoke. I remembered, Lewis. Every day, even hating you, I remembered. So did I, Lewis said, and crossed the room finally, dropping to his knees beside the bed and taking his brother's thin, fever-warm hand in both of his own. Every single day, Daniel, I am so sorry. I am so sorry it took me 11 years and your dying breath to say it. Don't talk about dying breath just yet, Daniel said, with the faintest ghost of the old dry humor Lewis remembered from their boyhood, though his voice had gone thick with tears. I've held on this long out of spite. I might hold on a while longer, now that you've finally shown up to make it interesting. It was Anna, standing quietly in the doorway and listening to the whole exchange, who stepped forward then, her voice gentle but carrying the same practical authority Lewis had come to know on the trail. Mrs. Keene, if I might ask, has the doctor said what exactly is causing the fever? 11 years running a relay station, a person picks up some rough medical knowledge treating hands and travelers with no doctor for 50 miles. Emily looked at her, startled. Then something like desperate hope crossed her tired face. Doctor says it's pneumonia settled on top of a chest wound that never fully healed right from a mine accident 2 years back. Says his lungs are too scarred to fight it properly. Anna moved to the bedside, studying Daniel with a clinical attention that Lewis had not seen her use before, and gently, with Emily's permission, pressed her fingers along his ribs and throat, listened to the rattle of his breathing with her ear near his chest, in a way that made Daniel wince but did not protest. "There's fluid built up here," Anna said finally, straightening. "I've seen this before up at the station, travelers caught out in the cold too long. If it's only fever and congestion, willow bark tea and mustard poultices might turn it, given time and rest. But if there's fluid actually pooling in the chest cavity, that's beyond what any poultice can fix, and he'll need it drawn off or he won't improve no matter how much willpower he's got left." "The doctor said something about that," Emily said, wringing her hands. "Said it might come to that, but that it was dangerous, and he wasn't confident he'd done the procedure enough times to trust his own hand with it out here, without proper instruments. Where is this doctor now?" "Attending a birth on the far side of town. Might be hours before he's free." Anna's jaw set in a way Lewis recognized from the standoff on the mountain trail, the look of a woman deciding that waiting was a luxury nobody in the room could afford. "I've assisted with a chest draw twice, at the station, once on a miner with a punctured lung, and once on a traveler with pneumonia much like this. I'm no doctor, Mrs. Keene, and I won't pretend otherwise, but I know the procedure, and if your husband is drowning in his own chest while we wait for your doctor to finish a birth on the other side of town, I don't like those odds any better than the ones I'd be offering with a needle and a steady hand." Emily looked to Daniel, who managed a weak, rasping laugh. "Well, someone finally showed up in this house who talks sense instead of standing around wringing their hands. Do it, if you're willing. I'd rather take my chances with someone who knows what she's doing than wait on a doctor who's not sure of his own hand either." What followed was an hour that Lewis would remember for the rest of his life as the longest and most harrowing of the entire journey, longer than the storm on the mountain, longer than the standoff with the drifters on the trail. Anna worked with a steady, focused calm that belied whatever fear she must have carried beneath it, sterilizing a long needle in the flame of a lamp, working with Emily to prop Daniel into position, speaking to him in a low, reassuring voice throughout, while Lewis stood at his brother's head, gripping his hand, whispering whatever encouragement he could summon as Anna drew off, with painstaking care, a slow accumulation of fluid that had indeed been drowning his brother's lungs from the inside. When it was done, Daniel's breathing came easier almost immediately, the terrible rattle in his chest quieting to something closer to normal, and though he was exhausted and pale from the ordeal, something in his face had eased that had not been there before, some fight for air relaxing into simple, honest sleep. "He should rest now," Anna said, cleaning her instruments with hands that Lewis only now saw were shaking with the aftermath of tension held too long. "The fever may still take a few days to fully break, but I think, if he doesn't take a turn for worse, he has a real chance now. A real one, not just the kind we say to comfort a family." Emily was weeping openly now, gripping Anna's hands with a fervor that needed no words to explain itself, and Lewis, watching the two women, felt something in his own chest loosen for the first time since the letter had arrived on that cold October Tuesday in Helena. Some fear he had been carrying so long he had nearly forgotten it was possible to set it down. The doctor arrived an hour later, examined Anna's work with evident and growing respect, and pronounced that she had likely saved Daniel's life by not waiting for his own delayed arrival, a judgment that made Emily cry harder and made Anna flush, with an embarrassment Lewis found unexpectedly endearing in a woman who had shown nothing but unshakable competence in every crisis he had watched her face across 400 miles of wilderness. Daniel's recovery, once begun, proceeded steadily across the following 2 weeks. The fever broke on the 3rd day after Anna's procedure, and by the end of the first week he was sitting up, eating broth, and by the second week arguing with Lewis over checkers with something approaching his old boyhood vigor. The two brothers slowly, carefully, rebuilding across those long convalescent days, something that 11 years of silence and anger had nearly destroyed beyond repair. They talked in those weeks, more honestly than they had ever talked as young men on the rocking quay, before ambition and greed had come between them. Daniel spoke of the hard years after his exile, the false names, the ditch digging, the slow rebuilding of a life in Larkspur where he had eventually found honest work at the stamp mill, and 3 years later found Emily, a schoolteacher's daughter who had married him without ever once believing the old rumors that had followed him out of Texas. Lewis spoke of the emptiness underneath the success he had built, the way every acre of the bar quay had felt, in his private moments, like a monument to something he was deeply ashamed of, the way he had told himself for years that keeping busy, staying rich, staying occupied, was the same thing as being at peace, when it had never once been true. "I don't say this to make excuses," Lewis told him one evening in the second week, the two of them sitting together on the small back porch while Emily and Anna worked inside preparing supper. "But I want you to know that the ranch, the cattle, none of it ever made up for what I did to you. I told myself for years it would, that if I built something big enough I could bury the guilt under the size of it. It never worked, Daniel. Not once, not for a single night." "I believe you," Daniel said, and there was no bitterness left in it now, only a tired, hard-won peace. "For what it's worth, brother, I spent those same years believing my anger was keeping me strong, that hating you was some kind of armor against ever being that foolish, trusting boy again who thought his own brother would never do him wrong. It wasn't armor. It was just weight, same as your guilt was weight, and I'm glad, more glad than I know how to properly say, that we've finally both set some of it down." "Can we truly start over?" Lewis asked. "After everything?" Daniel considered the question seriously, watching the last light fade purple and gold over the mountains west of Larkspur. "I don't know that a man can ever fully go back to what he was before a wound like this one. But I think we can build something new, standing on what's left, the way a person rebuilds a cabin after a fire, using whatever timber survived. I'd like to try, Lewis. I've got a wife and a home here now, and you've got nothing left but the clothes on your back and whatever's in that saddlebag, from what Emily tells me, and there's something almost fitting in that, in you finally standing on ground as humble as the one you put me on 11 years ago. Maybe that's where a fresh start actually has room to grow." It was, Lewis thought, more grace than he had any right to expect, and he found himself weeping quietly on that back porch in a way he had not allowed himself to weep since he was a boy. While inside the small house, through the lamplit window, he could see Anna and Emily moving together in the warm domestic rhythm of setting a table, and something in that simple, ordinary sight settled deep into his chest and stayed there. It was 3 days later, on a clear cold evening with the first proper snow of the season falling soft and silent over Larkspur, that Lewis finally found the courage to say to Anna Hurst the thing he had been carrying since the fire in the line shack, since the standoff on the mountain trail, since every mile of the 400 that had brought them here together. They were standing outside the Keene house, Anna preparing to check on the horses before turning in, when Lewis caught her hand and she turned to face him, snow catching in the dark strands of hair that had escaped from beneath her hat, her breath visible in the cold air between them. "I have nothing left to offer you," Lewis said, the words coming out rougher than he intended, 12 days of accumulated feeling finally breaking loose. "No ranch, no fortune, nothing but the 2 horses we rode in on, and whatever honest work I can find to build a life from nothing, same as your husband and my brother both once had to do. I know that's a poor thing to offer a woman who has never asked me for anything at all, but I love you, Anna Hurst. I think I began loving you somewhere on that mountain in the storm, watching you decide, over and over, to be brave rather than safe. And I have never in my life met anyone I trusted the way I trust you, and I don't want to ride away from Larkspur without you knowing that, Whatever you decide to do with the knowing." Anna was quiet a long moment, snow settling on her shoulders, on the brim of her hat, and when she finally spoke her voice was unsteady in a way he had not heard from her before, not even in the worst of the mountain storm or the standoff with the drifters. "I told myself, after Thomas died, that I wouldn't let myself want this again," she said. "It felt safer somehow to keep the station running alone, to keep my heart as busy and armored as that fortress you built for yourself in Montana, because wanting something, wanting someone, means you can lose them, and I already know exactly how much that costs." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears in the fading light. "But I watched you these past 2 weeks, watched you finally set down that fortress you'd been carrying for 11 years, watched you kneel beside your brother's bed and choose the truth over your own comfort, and I don't think I can keep pretending I haven't fallen in love with the man who did that. I have, Lewis. Somewhere on that mountain, or maybe before at my own kitchen table, watching you tell me the truth when you could have kept lying. I love you too." Lewis felt something break open in his chest that was pure, unguarded joy, the first he had allowed himself to feel in longer than he could remember, and he pulled Anna into his arms there in the falling snow, and when he kissed her, it felt like the final piece of a fortune far greater than the one he had given away, settling finally, completely into place. They were married in Larkspur 3 weeks later, in the small church at the north end of town, with Daniel, still recovering but strong enough now to stand as his brother's best man, and Emily weeping happily beside Anna throughout the brief, simple ceremony conducted by the town's circuit preacher. There was no grand celebration, no fine dress bought with mining shares or cattle profits, only a modest gathering of the small community that had watched this strange, hard-won reconciliation unfold across the autumn weeks, and Lewis Keene, standing at the altar in his one good coat with nothing to his name, but the woman beside him and the brother behind him, felt himself to be, for the first time in 11 years, an entirely, unambiguously happy man. They settled in Larkspur that winter, Lewis taking honest work at the stamp mill alongside Daniel while he learned the trade, and by spring, using what small savings they had managed together, he and Daniel purchased a modest parcel of grazing land at the edge of town, not the sprawling empire of the Bar K, but enough for 100 head of cattle and a small honest herd built slowly, carefully, from the ground up. The two brothers working it side by side the way they had once dreamed of doing as boys on the rocking K, before greed and betrayal had ever entered into the story. Anna kept the relay station running for another year under the care of her hired man Silas Ford, visiting it seasonally to manage the accounts, before she and Lewis finally sold the contract to the stage line in the autumn of 1881. Using the proceeds to expand the small Keene ranch outside Larkspur into something that supported both families comfortably, though never again anything close to the fortune Lewis had once commanded in Montana. He found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not miss it. There was a peace in the smallness of the life they built, a peace he had never once found in the vast holdings of the Bar K, and every evening, watching Anna move through the kitchen of the small ranch house they had built together, or watching Daniel and Emily's growing family gather at their table on Sunday afternoons, he understood finally the truth his brother had spoken to him that first difficult night in the sick room, that a person could not go back to what they were before a wound like theirs. But they could build something new and lasting from whatever timber survived the fire. Their first son was born in the spring of 1882, a dark-haired boy they named Thomas, after the husband Anna had lost to the mountain, and Lewis wept holding him for the first time with an openness he would once have found impossible in the hardened cattle baron he had been in Montana. Their second child arrived 2 years later, a daughter they named Grace, and by then the small ranch had grown steadily under the joint care of both Keene brothers, prosperous in the modest, honest way that Lewis had come to value far more than the glittering empire he had once ruled alone. Daniel and Emily, for their part, went on to have 2 children of their own in the years that followed, and the 2 Keene families built their houses close enough together on the shared land that the children grew up as much cousins in fact as they were in name, running wild together across the same grazing hills their fathers worked, learning early the story of the terrible thing that had once come between their fathers and the harder, better thing that had finally healed it. Told to them not as a secret to be ashamed of, but as a lesson in what forgiveness could accomplish when a person was brave enough to offer it and humble enough to earn it. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Anna beside him, watching their children play in the last gold light of a Wyoming summer, Lewis Keene sometimes thought back to that cold October morning in Helena when the letter had arrived, when he had stood on the porch of the Bar K and understood, with a clarity that had frightened him at the time, that he was about to trade away everything he had spent a lifetime building for one uncertain chance at forgiveness. He had believed in that moment that he was making the hardest bargain of his life. He understood now, all these years later, that he had in fact made the finest one. He had traded a fortune built on a lie for a life built on truth, and in the trading, he had found not only his brother again, but the woman who had guided him through the storm to reach him, and a family larger and richer in every way that mattered than any empire of cattle and gold could ever have given him. The Bar K, with all its acres and all its wealth, had never once made him feel the way he felt now, sitting on this modest porch with Anna's hand in his and his children's laughter carrying on the evening wind. And he knew, with the same certainty that had once sent him riding into a mountain storm to reach a dying brother, that he would make the same trade again, every single time, without a moment's hesitation. Anna, watching the same sunset beside him, leaned her head against his shoulder and said, quietly, the words that had become something of a small tradition between them on evenings like this one. "Any regrets, Lewis Keene, about the fortune you gave away?" "Only that I didn't give it away sooner," Lewis said, and pulled her closer, and together they watched the light fade gold and then rose and then finally soft blue over the mountains that had once nearly killed them both, and had instead, against every reasonable expectation, given them everything.